cannabis, marijuana use was associated with increased risks of thoughts of suicide or suicidal ideation, suicide plan, and suicide attempt. These associations remained regardless of whether someone was also experiencing depression, and the risks were greater for women than for men. The study was published in JAMA Network Open and was conducted by researchers at the National Institute on Drug Abuse, part of the National Institute of Health. National Institute on Drug Abuse Director Dr. Nora Volkow, senior author on this study, stated, "As we better understand the relationship between cannabis use, depression, and suicidality, clinicians will be able to provide better guidance and care to patients." The number of adults in the United States who use cannabis more than doubled from 22.6 million in 2008 to 45 million in 2019. And the number of daily or near-daily users almost tripled from 3.6 million to 9.8 million in 2019. Over the same time span, the number of adults with depression also increased, as did the number of people who reported suicidal ideation or suicide plan, or who died by suicide. For their analysis, NIDA researchers compared 4 levels of past year cannabis use: no cannabis use, non-daily cannabis use, daily cannabis use, which was defined as use on at least 300 days per year, and the presence of cannabis use disorder, which was assessed in the survey and involved meeting specific criteria for patterns on continued cannabis use despite negative consequences. To determine the presence of depression, they assessed the prevalence of major depressive episodes based on specific diagnostic criteria measured through the survey. The results of the study indicated that even people who use cannabis non-daily, fewer than 300 days a year, were more likely to have suicidal ideation and to plan or attempt suicide than those who did not use the drug at all. These associations remained regardless of whether someone was also experiencing depression. Among people with a major depressive episode, about 3% of those who did not use cannabis had suicidal ideation, compared with about 7% of those with non-daily cannabis use, about 9% of those with daily cannabis use, and 14% of those with a cannabis use disorder. Among those with depression, 35% of people who did not use cannabis had suicidal ideation, compared to 44% of those with non-daily cannabis use, and 53% of those who use cannabis daily, and 50% of those who had a cannabis use disorder. The researchers found that women who had used cannabis at any level were more likely to have suicidal ideation or report a suicide plan or suicide attempt than men with the same level of cannabis use. Among women without major depressive episode, the prevalence of suicide ideation was 13.9% and 3.5% for women without cannabis use disorder. For men, the percentages were 9.9% and 3%, respectively. Suicide is a leading cause of death among young adults in the United States, and studies like this may help reduce this risk. Depression and cannabis use disorders are treatable conditions, and cannabis use can be modified. Converging evidence indicates that adolescent-onset cannabis exposure is associated with short and possibly long-term impairments in cognition, worse academic and vocational outcomes, and increased prevalence of psychotic, mood, and addictive disorders. If you or someone you know is in crisis and needs help, please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK That's 1-800-273-8255. For more helpful information regarding the subject of addiction, please contact us at the Institute for Addiction Study. You can find our link in the description.